at the age of 83, one day in May was taken ill and died. And after she was dead, the will of course was read by the lawyer as we all stood by his side. To my brother it was found she had left £100, the same unto my sister I declare. But when it came to me, the lawyer said, I see Granny's left to you her own.
July 10th, 2009, we're in the home of Helen Dastrup, who is my mother, sister, and my aunt. Honored you to take some time with us. I want to just go over memories and have you speak into the camera if you would.
Well, you'll have to prompt me because I will have to dredge those up from a long distant past.
It's intriguing in reading my sister's book of One Voice, A History of A.L. and Olive Hank's family, where you talk about just barely surviving being the close call you had as a baby. Actually, with what you had, was it a liver problem?
It was an abscess on the liver, and back in those days before antibiotics, they couldn't treat it that way, and it was spread through the whole liver. And the doctor told Mother that there was that I couldn't live, that I had one chance in 1,000 of surviving. And she said, well, could I poultice it with a flaxseed poultice? And he said, well, Mrs. Hanks, that couldn't do any harm. So she told me that she poulticed it for 3 days, I think, and pulled it out through the ribs. And he gathered it into one place and it came out through the ribs. And then and Barbara describes how he laid me on the table in the, well, Dad went to town to get him because the roads were closed with snow. And he was all dressed up like a cowboy with chaps and so on, and expecting his own horse. And Dad went in on old Maud and brought him back behind him. Then Barbara describes how they stood around the table, and the doctor took his scissors and jabbed it into my side between my ribs, and she said, and the pus just shot out. And I said, yeah, and he must have done that 3 times because I have 3 incisions. Oh no, you only have 1 incision. I said, my dear, I can show them to you. Do you want me to show them to you? Oh no.
There's almost a sense of reverence. I mean, why in the world would your mother know to even do that? I mean, how would she have known that?
Because that's one of those early remedies. I remember having her poultice me for different, well, oatmeal was a poultice and flaxseed was a poultice, and let's see what else did. Those are the 2 things I remember, but I think there are other things that you could use with heat, and heat helps too, to pull it to a head.
You're the 6th in the family, aren't you?
Yes.
6th of 8?
Mm-hmm. I'm right after the 3 boys, Morgan, Howard, and Richard. And so I grew up being kind of a tomboy, or quite a tomboy, and always feeling bad that I was not privileged to be a man or a boy. And that grieved me all my life.
Does it grieve you still?
Sometimes.
Really?
Well, it does when men are condescending to women, and and when I hear about things like the people in Iraq and Iran and Saudi Arabia and how the women are treated over there, that really makes me angry.
Did your brothers ever protect you, or were they a protective sort?
I don't know. They weren't demonstrative, but then nobody in the family was demonstrative. And but I loved to play with them, and I remember the thing that I loved to play most with them was when they got a few minutes off from having to work, which we all did every day, all day, and they had kind of a fort set up where they were a gang of outlaws, I guess, and that would be their saloon. And then I could play with them if I would run to the garden and pick green beans and bring them back for them to smoke like cigars.
My mother's how many years older than you then?
8.
8. She was your big sister then?
She was my big sister and my surrogate mother, because mother was pretty busy. And your mother has such a gentle soul, as you know, that she was, I followed Beth around and hung on to her all the time, and Beth was always patient with me and sweet. And then when Charles and Catherine were born in the little gray house down back from the brick one, they were such a big part of my life. And I remember the night that Catherine was born, how sick she was, and we had Charles and taking care of him, and Marion and I nearly ate those two children up. We just did. I remember once when Charles was quite stubborn, and I remember one time when he wanted to go to town with his mother, and she said, "No, you cannot go," and he was determined. And so I held him so he couldn't run and get in the car, and as she drove away, I let go of him, and he ran after her for quite a long distance before I guess he realized that he had no hope of catching his mother.
Memories of your parents, your dad, funerals and singing and work.
You know, the most important thing, I think, the greatest influence on me that I can remember my dad having was that he went to Ireland on a mission, and he had a nice singing voice. And so on the boat going over, at least coming back, I'm not sure whether it was the same thing going over, but he sang for people. And he brought back with him from Ireland a trunk full of Irish linen, and we ate our very plain fare on Irish linen for my whole life.
Was that bread and milk on
that? That
linen?
was bread and milk. And if tomatoes were in season, we ate tomatoes for weeks. If you probably had the same kind of upbringing. You ate whatever there was.
And lots of pulse, grains,
yes,
you know, whatever.
Is that what pulse is?
Yes,
grains?
Seeds. The Daniel and the...
I remember Daniel ate pulse, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
And Stephen mentioned, well, we grew up on pulse, you know, afterwards. The curious reference to dandelion tea. Do you have memories of that?
Oh, I certainly do. I was anemic all the time, and Mother was just sure she had to. And besides that, I didn't like food. I just drank milk, raw milk. And at least I didn't like the food at home.
Yeah.
And so to bolster my constitution, she made me drink dandelion tea every day. And during the summer, when it was lush and the leaves were green, she would dry them, and then I'd have dandelion tea all winter too. And I hated this stuff. I just hated dandelion tea. It was bitter.
Can you look at a field of dandelions without having feelings?
I've kind of gone past that, but you have brought them back fleetingly here. Well, you asked about your mother, and I found something that I think maybe you might like to hear here. And Mother had written this. I just read this in her diary that Edwin brought and let me borrow until the next time somebody goes to Burley and takes it back to him. Although it's just full of Mother talking about her flowers and
trees
and her trees and the birthday party and so on. Nothing very earth-shaking, but and she calls your father Card, and I know he prefers to be called Alma, but back in those days he was called Card.
To his family, he's called Card.
And all the Hankses call him that now, except me. I call him Alma. So I will substitute in deference to Alma his name for instead of the Card that's written here on this paper. Elizabeth and Alma arrived home on December 18th, Saturday evening. Someone knocked at the big front door, as we sometimes call it. I said in fun, "Go to the door, here's Beth," because I had been saying it in fun all day. And this time it was true, much to my surprise. Let's see, let me skip down here. On Wednesday evening, December the 22nd, the girls presented the one-act play. Oh, this isn't what I thought it was. Sorry, let me turn the page. It's a weeping Christmas. How could it be otherwise while this awful war lasts? I had 100 sheets of mimeograph carols for singing in the program, but I don't know why that's in there. We had such a beautiful Christmas tree. Elizabeth and Alma, Morgan and Beatrice were here. We observed Christmas dinner and with my family and father and Sister Mary and Bobby and Kathy. Today Beth left for Star Valley, leaving an emptiness in the home that can never be filled. I can't express my feelings of desolation. There were so many things I wanted to tell Alma, so many things I felt for her, but all I could say was, take good care of her, Alma. Her violin, her music and scrapbook, all the books I received at Christmas, Emmy Lou, Rebecca, etc., she took to give a place in the home that they are making. When her husband left for a mission shortly after their marriage, I was happy to have her home again. I said, I'll have her a while longer and shall be fortified against the parting. But oh, it wasn't. I wasn't fortified. But Mary Beth was very much a beloved part of our home. Barbara worked outside a lot because she wasn't afraid of the animals, and she wasn't above scooping manure and so on, and helping Dad, but as the oldest daughter. But Beth kind of was too timid to do those things. If an animal ran at her, she ran and got behind a tree or whatever. And so she was mostly in the house, and she had a very gentle influence. She was very, very shy. In fact, I remember one time when, and I think this happened more than once, but I have a vivid memory of this one time, when someone came to the door that she was afraid of, and she was in high school, and she went and got under the dining room table that had the cloth hanging down where she could hide.
Where do you fall then? If Barbara was the rugged, outdoors farm, I mean, you talk about being a tomboy. Were you outdoor all the time?
Well, most of the time. I did my first, the first things I did was to lead the dairy course, like that's the first thing you do when you're growing up. And then I remember when I was 8, I asked if I could thin an acre of beads, which was an enormous amount of beads. Took me a long time, but I earned $8, and I can't even begin to tell you the number of things I was able to buy with that $8. That was a fortune to me.
Didn't your mother always have a banking system within the family for your kids?
I think she did for the older ones, but she didn't for Marion and David and I. Marion and David and I kind of fit in a category of our own.
Well, you're the leader of the Three Musketeers.
Yes, I guess I am.
Tell me about music and growing up with your mom's influence.
Well, and Dad, I strayed off that subject, but he brought back from Ireland music of Ireland, which I grew up loving and singing, and Mother brought with her from her days of teaching school things that she had taught to her groups in school, and we sang all the time. That was our chief recreation. And I remember the most thrilling times of my life were when my dad's brothers and sisters would come to Burley, and they'd come and all sit in the living room, and we'd say, hello, let's sing. And so we would sing. And I remember Aunt Gladys, who used to sing duets with Dad, she just thrilled me to pieces. She was the one that sang The Old Armchair that I kind of inherited singing.
Well, that song came from England with,
that came from,
with your grandfather, Hanks?
Emmanuel,
yeah.
Grandpa Emmanuel, Hank.
Well, that has almost been a signature song in some ways to me, and you singing it. And it tells a story which warms me every time I hear. as far as the values. When you look at music that's been part of your life, are there songs that define the way you feel about things or the way you see life, or has it affected your outlook?
It's affected my outlook more than anything else. I know that when I was, long before I went to school, I was singing all the time, and I could hear an alto, so I like to sing alto as harmony, and that's very unusual. But as far as music is concerned, I learned my vocabulary and scriptures, and I can't tell you how many things have happened to me through music, and those are the things I remember because I remember the words to all kinds of, and my family has this big joke going that every time anybody brings up a subject, whatever it is, I can sing a song about it or say a poem about it.
And that's who you are in a large measure, isn't it? Your dad sang, you know, the from Dvorak's, what's it called, Going Home,
yeah,
and Signature. Another one is Little Gray House in the West.
Little Gray Home in the West.
Yeah, songs, and Sunshine of Your Smiles. Another. What's the one with the ships, traveling ships? Be it Home in Scotland by. Another one of the songs that I've heard the family sing a lot, and they sing it at fast speeds.
Oh, a capital ship for an ocean trip with a walloping window blind. No wind that blew dismayed the crew or troubled the captain's mind. The man at the wheel was made to feel content for the wildest blow, and oft appeared when the gale had cleared to have been in his bunk below. Anyway,
and then they speed it up.
And then it speeded up, and Morgan could sing it faster than anybody, and Beth always had to play it because she could play it faster than anybody. So and Dad singing Going Home, he sang that hundreds of times at funerals. And when Barbara and Beth left for college, I was about 12, and it became my turn to play for him to sing for funerals. So my education was liberally sprinkled with being excused from school a couple of afternoons a week to go to a funeral to play for Dad to sing.
It seems an odd claim to think that somebody sang for 2 funerals a week, but I've heard it from almost every one of the siblings, so it's not a stretch. Was that the song he always sang too?
Almost always. He almost always sang that one, and because that was what they requested, and then something else.
It's an odd question, I know, but I was trying to think, if you were to pick out your own music for the celebration of your life, what would it include?
Oh heavens, I don't know.
I said it's an odd question.
Yes, it is. That's one you should have asked me earlier so that I could have...
You'll be thinking about it now the rest of the time.
But let me hark back to playing for Dad to sing for funerals. Sure. That's the way I learned to play the piano.
Didn't you ever have formal lessons?
Not very many.
This playing by ear, just a natural gift.
Well, that playing by ear is different than... Playing by ear means you can sit down and without knowing where it comes from, you just play. But to play by note, you have to read it off the page. And for someone to have the ability to play by ear, but also to have the discipline to learn to play by notes is a tremendous asset to any group.
And you have that?
No, I can't. I don't play by ear very well. Although I can play melodies by ear and chord a little bit, but nothing like people who really play well do.
Music and theater. What about the theater side of your experience?
Well, Mother was a big person about programs. As I said, I've just been reading this diary of Mother's. She called it the Diary of a Bishop's Wife. And what did you ask me?
About theater.
Oh, about theater. Anyway, one of the things she did constantly was put on programs. And since I've been married and been every ward and stake I've ever been in, I've always put on programs. And I think I've put on a Christmas sacrament meeting every year for at least 60 years until I moved here. And now there isn't anybody that wants to hear those kinds of things anymore. But I also, Mother also gave me the opportunity of being in things like The Princess Winsome, in which Richard was Frog-Eye Fearsome, the ogre, and he approached the witch and asked her to put a spell on the king's children, and she said, I'll do it for the prince, but I can't do it for the princess because she can spin love's golden thread. And so she brewed up a brew of this hank of hair, this patch of fur, this feather, and this flapping fin, this claw, this bone, this dried snake skin, bubble and boil and snakeskin coil. This charm shall all something or other, the ogre, and something about the ogre foiling. Anyway, so in the upstairs room of the castle, it had a window in the castle, and there I sat on a chair or a stool with the spinning wheel that's been part of the family since Grandma Edwards, great-grandma Edwards, I guess. And with Prince the dog, which was a great big stuffed animal sitting by me, and so that was one of my early beginnings. She also put on Little Women, and I got to be when my cousin Eleanor, who was cast as Jo in Little Women, had to have an operation because they found a tumor inside of her the size of a football. And so I got to play the role instead, and that was wonderful. And one of the things I remember about it was that Morgan's wife, Beatrice, just suddenly said, I'll take you over, I'll do your hair, I'll get you dressed, I'll do all those kinds of things that I wasn't aware that somebody who played the lead in the film or in a play needed somebody to take care of them, but she did that for me. And then there were several others. Mother put on a Christmas program every Christmas Eve, and I was in most of them. And,
are those good memories by
they're
and large?
wonderful memories, and they really did influence me, and I'm sure they did the rest of the family, because we Hankses put on programs. Your mother did that, and...
It's strange that a timid person like my mother would be confident in public to do that.
But your mother is so carried away by her imagination and the love of organizing things and making things, well, because it's a creative process, and she has to be doing creative processes all the time in order to be happy, don't you think?
Absolutely. Absolutely agree. And heaven will be a more organized place when she gets there. Are there songs that you hear that make you think of your siblings and your parents? Specifically?
Just songs from my childhood. Let's see which.
I mean, I think of poetry when I think of Richard and citing the Sam McGee, you know.
The cremation of Sam McGee. And let's see. There are just so many. And whenever I hear one, I think of the family. I guess maybe the signature one would be The Old Armchair.
Your mother's poetry and writing talks a lot about looking at things from a poet's, almost from a poet's viewpoint, and the wind and the full blossoms on the trees.
That was big to her.
Well, and you think of her Indiana upbringing. Do you have reactions like that when you see farm settings now? I mean, you've been away from Burley most of your entire life now, most of it.
But you know, I never drive with my husband or myself through the countryside that I don't look on each side of the road and think, oh, there's alfalfa, and ha-ha, that's beets, and see those potatoes over there, you know.
So there's a pragmatic side to your
Well, I think that people who are raised in rural settings have a different mindset and a different connection to what's fundamental than kids who are born.
How did this country girl fit into the urban setting then, as you did most of your life?
Well, because I just went around being me, and if there was something to say, I said it as directly as I could think of. and people either could take me or they stayed out of the kitchen. And
is direct a term you would use for most of your family members?
Oh, absolutely. Don't you think so?
I'm not disagreeing.
You don't have an opinion in this.
I do. But, you know, how does, you know, I think of Morgan especially as being big and brusque and direct, almost imposing and intimidating. And yet there is behind almost every one of your siblings a gentleness and a softness that's been cultivated by music and other things.
Morgan was always blustery, and he was even more direct and candid than I have ever been. But he did it, I think, on purpose to
shield himself from...
No, he just liked to shock people, and I did too. I enjoyed shocking people, and his wives would cringe about what Morgan was doing. But he should have been a lawyer because he had the gift of gab, the gift of talking, and it was hard to get a word in edgewise with Morgan.
He sang on the big stage.
Yeah, he sang in the opera chorus in Phoenix for quite a few years, and so did Luann, his present wife.
Where did you learn that you were good enough as a singer to sing for big audiences?
Well, the first song I ever sang, the first solo that I can remember singing is for our neighbor girl's wedding, and I think I was probably around 5, I don't know. And people said, well, you won't be able to hear her. But they could, easily, because I learned to sing on the farm at the top of my lungs.
Oh, is that, you do mention that your mother occasionally had to tone you down because you were drowning out
the whole chorus.
It's just natural for you to sing loud then, huh?
Well, I just have a big voice. That's the way you cultivate a muscle, is by exercising it, and you also do that with a voice. If you always sing timidly, then your voice never gets big.
Big voice, big art?
Well, that's nicely said. I hope it's true. You know, while I'm thinking about it, I have here something that I wrote home to Mother and Dad, and I can actually read this because I typed it.
Please do. Look into the camera.
This is about, it was just before we did King and I in Sacramento, which was a big deal. It was a beautiful production, and Mother had the children all that summer while I was not only directing the music but was also playing Anna. And but for some reason or other, your family came to Sacramento to see a baseball game or something. No, but this was before that. It was the same summer. Oh,
it was the summer we went to San Francisco.
Yes, when you went.
We came back every night to Sacramento and then went back to
San Francisco. I don't remember that part.
1960, it was in the 60s because Haight-Ashbury was still...
It was July 3rd, 1967 that I wrote this letter. Beth and Alma arrived on schedule. Thank you very much for the meet. That's always a welcome item. They got here about 6:30 on Saturday evening, and they didn't seem to be too exhausted from the trip. The kids have a hard time adjusting to city ways, and Ellen and Alvin Paul were up surf skating before 6 o'clock on Sunday morning. I staggered out of bed and made them come back into the house. The neighbors will all rise up in a body and protest if I let them do that sort of thing. But they get bored very easily, and it's understandable since they're used to a great deal of freedom. Yesterday I gave them a chicken dinner after Sunday school and testimony meeting. Tony said to me, "Boy, you sure have long meetings in California." And as was said of the Ruggles children after their dinner party, they laid back like gorged boa constrictors. These kids ate until I know they were all in pain. John made faces about everything, but after he tried each item, he ate very well. Tony had at least 8 or 9 glasses of root beer. Morris bought 2 gallons, and they drank every drop. They are cute kids. Beth looks better than she has looked in years. It must be all those vitamins and things she's taking. I left them this morning lingering over their breakfast, and then they were going to San Francisco.
Did you want to be reimbursed for the root beer?
I think that, no, that wasn't the point.
When you were, I guess the nice way of saying it, your married life hasn't always been happily ever after.
No.
Since you left the Salt Lake Temple. How important was your family as a support system when you were struggling and going through?
Well, your father was a very important part of it because he was the one person who believed my story. And he was the one person who felt when I married him in the first place that it was wrong. And I remember him whispering to me when we left the temple that to be sure that we prayed together every night, or frequently. And then when I divorced Mark, and everybody was astonished by it because I'd never said anything to the family. And Mother was terribly grieved about it, and our bishop called and told her that it was okay, that it was meant to be, and then Morris came into the picture right away because he was supposed to. And then I understand the family began saying, oh, that's the reason she left Mark. That's she sees this other man she wants. And your dad defended me, and I'm ever grateful for that, because that wasn't the case. It was meant to be, and I was led along as truly as every step of the way. Nobody could make up something like that or make it work out the way it did.
When I think you mentioned one time you used to go to church and always be a little bit melancholy in church, almost being in tears at times during your struggle in your first marriage.
Well, on Mother's Day I usually went and sat and cried, but and then I got to the point where I just cried all the time, and that was one of the reasons that it brought it to a head. I couldn't quit crying, and Jennifer said to me one time, Mama, why do you always cry when Daddy comes home? And
it kind of cuts you to the quick, doesn't it? Interesting that, did your kids find solace in Burley?
They loved Burley, and the role your mother played in making them clothes and your family. And when before Jennifer died, I asked her if there had been anything in her life that had been joyful to her, and she said, oh yes, my favorite part was going to Burley every summer. And the year that Zibby was born, she was born in May, and we didn't go to Burley that year, and Robin cried and said, I want to go to Burley and eat peas in that other grandma's garden.
Is there a reason you called Zibby, named her Elizabeth? I've never asked that.
Well, Elizabeth has probably more nicknames to it than anything else, and I started out by calling her Betsy because I wanted to differentiate between Elizabeth Hanks Clark and my Elizabeth, and then my former mother-in-law said she'd heard a little girl named Elizabeth called Zibby when she was over in Hawaii, and I said, that's it, that's what I want to call her. So,
did you name her after my mother, or was it just a...
I named her after your mother. And I also named her after your mother because the reason I got pregnant with Zibby was because when I was in Burley one summer, your dad got me in a corner and said, is this all the kids you're going to have? And I had 3. I guess he didn't say it that way, but anyway, that was
pretty close.
Upshot of it. And then he quoted to me from the book by Joseph Fielding Smith about how it was my duty to bring as many children into the world as I could, and so I left Burley, and when I left Burley I went home and got immediately pregnant. And Zibby was it. And she was a really special baby, and she's been a really special woman. And when she was born, she had the cord tied around her neck 4 times. I don't know how she ever got here. Anyway.
Your kids had a different upbringing than you had.
Oh, much. Well, in some ways, but the most different thing about it is that they suddenly got 6 stepbrothers and sisters.
Oh.
That's very modifying.
I am still intrigued how you would explain that Zibby married her stepfather's son, and that the wording on that announcement must have been the most careful writing ever done.
I think it was Mrs. Morris Dastrup announces the married. No, Mr. and Mrs. Morris Dastrup announced the marriage of her daughter, Elizabeth Butler, to Stephen Morris Dastrup.
Your reaction to when that happened, did it come out of the blue or just seem natural to you?
It seemed quite natural. Zibby really, she's quite a lot younger than Stephen, and she, as a girl, when we got together as a family, she kind of idolized him, and then when he came home from his mission, she was all grown up, and he was much attracted to her, so they were married when she was about 18, which is pretty early as far as I'm concerned.
Well, it is early, there's no question about that. I mean, a struggle.
Yeah.
You know, it's somebody who's been through it.
She has.
And there is something that comes with, and you would easily be classified as a survivor of the School of Hard Knocks.
Yeah, but you just do it a day at a time, don't you, Tony?
Yeah.
You've been through that with this accident as much as
yeah,
with me.
and the struggles before that. I mean, and sometimes in those private moments is when some of the music becomes most important.
You mean when you wake in the night?
Yes.
And you can't.
Especially at night when your mind is racing and your body's not in cohesion with your spirit, and you pray and you struggle and you find solace
and you're refined.
Yeah, it's a continual refinement.
Yeah.
Why don't you tell your kids what Morris has meant to your life and how your life has changed since he's come into it?
Well, first, before I do that, and while I'm thinking about it, I would like to pay tribute to my sister Beth, and I know that this is being taped for her 90th birthday. Good grief, how do you get to be 90? And good grief, how did I get to be 80? So, and she's been such a special part of my life, memories and things to fall back on, and I love you, Beth, and I want you to know that. And then you ask me again.
Could you talk about Morris?
About Morris.
And how your life has changed since he's come into your life?
Well, years ago, when one night Mark came home from, in the summer, he was a teacher in the winter, but in the summer he usually got another job, and that gave him the opportunity of staying home while I went to Burley, and that was something he encouraged. And but one night he came home from his job as a night watchman at a lumber mill that was nearby, and he said, I had the strangest thing happen to me in the night. And I said, what was it? And he said, I don't know, but a voice came into my mind very clearly that said to me, if you don't straighten up, you're going to lose Helen. And I said, oh, wow, what are you going to do about that? And he said, oh, nothing, because even if I do lose you, it won't be in this life, which was kind of indicative of his depth. But, and then we got the opportunity to move into a larger house. And Mark and I went just out of something to do on a Saturday when we were trying to reconcile our problems. And I saw this house that was much too big for us, the house that you came to in Sacramento. And I wanted it. And the realtor, and Mark said, we can't have this, we don't have the money. And the realtor said, maybe you do. Do you have a house you can trade? And we did. We had a little house that we could trade. So we moved from the house we were in on 73rd Street in Sacramento to the house on Lindale Drive, and it cost me $9 for a title search, and we moved in. And our mortgage payment went up a little. We had been paying a mortgage of about $80 a month, I think, and it went up to $125. So there was that house, and that put us in a different ward where we had a different bishop. And that was about the time that we were working on King and I, and Morris remembers that when he went to church one of the first times, because he had come to Sacramento on a church building mission as a supervisor to build a new building, and in our ward out in Elk Grove, California. And did you want to come and tell this story, dear?
No, you go ahead. I'll make any corrections. Go ahead.
And
editing privileges.
So he remembers that one Sunday Mark came to church and he had Fred with him, and and Bishop Hoyt told them that they were new in the ward, and that Helen would be coming as soon as King and I was over. And you know what? I have this terrible trouble keeping on a train of thought. What am I talking about?
About Morris coming into your life.
Oh, Morris coming into my life. Anyway, about that, and the first time Morris saw me was acting in King and I. The bishop dragged him to that, screaming because he didn't want to go, because he doesn't like poorly done road shows.
I thought maybe it's because you didn't want to hear that song.
No, it was...
Good Night, Young Lovers.
I just thought it was going to be a typical dumb road show, and I wasn't that interested in it.
Anyway, that's the first time he saw me, but a year later his wife died in July, I guess it was. And it was after that I began crying, and I couldn't stop. I was crying all the time. And one day I had to call the bishop's office and ask the counselor if he would teach my Sunday school class, and then the bishop, who had approached me before to ask me what was wrong, and I told him, well, I have problems, but I want to talk to you about it. And he said, I'm coming out there and I'm going to do something. You are going to tell me what's wrong. Well, after that, and he said to me, you can't live like this, you'll lose your mind. And after that, I was working with Morris on a song to sing for sacrament meeting, and he picked me up and we drove out to the church together, which was about 7 miles away. And I said to him, what would you say, Brother Dastrup, if I told you that I'm getting a divorce? You can't get a divorce! People in the church don't get a divorce!
Is that an exact quote?
That's pretty close.
And he really read me off. And so by the time I got to the church, I was pretty well undone. But as we drove into the parking lot, Bishop Hoyt drove in too and parked right by us. And we walked into the church together. And we went into the chapel, Morris and I, him to practice his song and me to play for him. And because we had gone early for choir practice, which I always direct him. And suddenly in the middle of what he was practicing, I couldn't hold it any longer, and I started to sob out loud, and I leaped off the piano, off the organ bench, and ran down the aisle and into the hallway. And Bishop Hoyt's office door was open, and he said, come in, Helen. I came early because I knew you needed me. And then Morris, one time when he was talking with the missionaries that he was over about one of them asking him if a divorce was ever okay, and he suddenly was infused by the Spirit and began giving a long dissertation on why divorce was sometimes okay in the church.
I said, yes.
It was long?
And he said, prove it. John Odell, he was a convert to the church, and he said, prove it.
Why don't you turn the
Let's get Morris in the picture here.
I don't want to be. Anyway, on that particular occasion, I had been out doing some shopping for the building. The church building missionary program was over, and these two gentlemen had been hired, as I had, by the church to stay and work on the building. Anyway, as I drove into the back of the church and they were sitting down there talking, and I made some chiding comment about when the cat's away, the mice don't play. And they said, we've been talking and we want to ask you a question. Is it ever possible in the church for people, acceptable, for people to get a divorce? Now, I had never, ever before, answered any differently than I did to her that day going out to the chapel. Oh, you can't get a divorce, it's not acceptable. And I said yes. And John Odell, who was this convert to the church and a fastidious reader of doctrine and books, said, prove it. And just, things just flew out of me.
Did they surprise you they were coming out of you? Did it surprise you this was coming out of you?
No, not really at the moment, but when I got finished, which was probably a good 10 minutes or more, of which I just never took a breath almost, other than just gave my point of view. And the one comment that stands out in my mind is that I said, it isn't acceptable for anyone to, or no one has the responsibility of sacrificing their life for somebody else. Only the Savior had that duty and responsibility, and no one else has that act of greatness within themselves to save somebody else's life, but to sacrifice their own. And that was the gist of the point. And when I got all through, John went, and he said, where did all that come from? Well, it came, of course, from the Spirit. And I was just fed.
Has there ever been any doubt in your mind that she was put in your life at the right time?
No, I can
vice versa.
Yeah, I can take it back to what my sister wants me to do, starting from Idaho Falls and going all the way through Sigurd as a bishop and into Mesa, and then get the church called to run a mission all the way to Sacramento, at which time my wife is suffering from leukemia, and we have, the doctor said, a maximum of 5 years, minimum of 2. We got 5 years, almost to the day, and right to where she was.
When your wife died, did it ever occur to you that there would be another woman come into your life? Did it ever even entered your scope of
not
thinking?
at that particular time. Because of the fact that I had 6 children, small, I had just made up my mind that there would not be anyone willing to marry 6 kids.
Now, when you did get married civilly, I understand those 6 kids took liberal use of riding on your car.
Well,
Oh, yes. We made them get rid of that before we even left.
But married with, what, 10 kids?
10 kids. We had 5 teenagers at our wedding, 10 children in total.
Is it true then, Uncle Morris, that you had the audacity to run off to another place in California and leave your new bride to mother all 10 of these children by herself?
I took a job in San Diego or Chula Vista, California, and left her to sell the house and keep things intact while that transition was going on. I left in August and we got the house sold in November.
Do you want to turn it back here?
Yeah, please do. You want to talk about that?
I want to finish up this story about Morris and I getting together. And one night, he had come over to the house and to visit with Mark and I one night after church. And Mark went to bed, and he and I visited. But when he left to go home, I could see that he just floated off the porch. I mean, I could actually see that he thought he wasn't touching the ground. And
that's a feeling I have.
And it wasn't much after that one night I was sobbing and crying, and I needed some help. So I had a good friend who lived in who had moved from Sacramento to San Leandro, California, which is by Oakland. And at 10 at night, I called him and said I needed him, and he said, "Well, drive down here," which I did in the driving rain, crying and praying. And when I got there, he put his hands on my head because he'd been part of this problem for a long time, and told me that I had blessings in store for me beyond my wildest dreams, but that no one in the room knew when that would happen. And then when I went home, and the next night I said to Mark, we have to settle this thing, and I think we need to get a divorce, but let's pray about it. And he said, "I don't want to pray." And I said, "Well, you're going to pray." And we knelt down by the bed, and I prayed first, and then he prayed an amazing prayer. I don't think he even knew what he was saying, but when he got up, he was white as chalk, staggered across the room and hung onto the dresser. And I said, "What's the matter with you?" And he said, "Nothing." I said, "What is wrong with you?" "Oh, nothing. I don't want to tell you about it." And I said, "But you will tell me about it." And so he did. And he said, "I just have this strange feeling that I should put your hand in Morris Dastrup's and fade quietly away." And which really shocked me. But it wasn't very long. I think it was probably the next day or in the next day or two that the bishop called from the church and said, "Helen, are you free? Can you come out to the church?" And I said, "Right now?" "Yes, right now." So I drove out to the church and stepped through the construction debris and said, "Good morning, Brother Dastrup." And he said, "Good morning, Sister Butler." And I went into the bishop's office, and he said, "What do you think of Morris Dastrup? Do you love him?" And I said, "No, we're good friends, but I don't love him." And he said, "Well, that's okay. If you're friends, it'll be all right, because you're supposed to marry him." And he said, in the night, last night, I sat up in bed straight up, and I said to my wife, Marion, "That's it. Helen and Morris are supposed to get married." So before I even filed for divorce, I knew I was going to marry Morris. And
so the bishop spoke Hanks to you?
He spoke Hanks to me.
Direct, right to the point?
So
but trying to explain that without context or setting can be a really difficult.
Absolutely.
And I can understand why people would maybe have little shadows creep into their mind.
Well, we decided we wouldn't tell anybody about it because nobody would believe such a weird story.
But it is that thread of divinity where things happen greater to you than you could conceive.
That's right.
That has happened.
And another thing that was important was that Mark moved away and left the house to me, and then Morris was able to move in, and even though we were snugly fit, there was still enough room for his family to merge with mine in that house.
So did you marry Helen for her money then?
Which we
in her
got,
house?
which I got for $9.
I married Helen because the bishop had told her that that's how it was supposed to happen, and I couldn't think of any
good excuse.
Anybody that I would sooner marry. Hey, but I want to tell you this: she was the choir director in the ward. I sang tenor in that choir. I was practically the only tenor most of the time.
And he's complained about it for our whole marriage.
Has he? He's had something to complain about?
But she was directing that choir, and I was watching her, and I had great regard for her. We've had many conversations. After that organ was installed and before the building was finished and dedicated, she would come out and practice the organ, and of course I just would go in and listen to her for a while, and then we'd get into conversations. And they were always gospel-centered, doctrinal questions, and I would go home and tell my wife what a remarkable woman she was and what a great knowledge and testimony of the gospel that she had. And I said, first of all, I finally found a woman that understands polygamy, because she has told me that she'd be willing to share her husband with other women. And that was kind of the summation of the thing, and all of this had taken place. Well, while I would sit up there in that choir seat, and this was after my wife had died, I would watch people coming in, and there were 2 or 3 ladies in the ward, and I would see them and I would think, now, if it was possible to find somebody like that was available, I could, you know, think about getting married. But I always had a firm conviction in the back of my mind that it would never happen, that no one would be willing to take on 6 kids. And I just had made up my mind that I would be raising them until they were grown, and whatever happened after that. From the time my wife died, I began a weekly fast. Every Thursday I fasted. And I was doing that right up to the time that all of this other stuff took place that brought an end to that, so to speak.
What were you fasting for specifically?
Basically to know what the Lord wanted me to do, and just to keep my life.
Do you think that put you in a position, as far as humility and being pliable, that you wouldn't have been in otherwise?
I think it helped a great deal. But I wasn't thinking about it in that regard necessarily. I just was thinking about it in terms of keeping myself in line, and so that I, you know, didn't do things that were not right and that sort of thing. Not too much chance when you have 6 kids you have to take care of, you know, night and day. But anyway, I never once focused on Helen as that person. Never thought about her in that sense. I never thought about being in love with her or having any feelings of her other than just a great admiration for what she was and who she was and her talent and ability and that sort of thing. Never thought about her ever in a romantic way until she's the one that told me that we were supposed to get married.
Well, after all, I was already married. How could you propose to?
Yeah, to a woman who's married. You finally make it through your experience and you moved to Chula Vista. Did you feel like you had a new chapter in your life at that point? Or were you just overwhelmed with 10 kids that...
Well, that was pretty overwhelming.
It is.
That becomes front and center all the time.
Yes. And yet time has passed.
Time has passed, and the children have made, Morris's children, some of them who didn't care for me at all because they thought I was too strict, have come around, and we've arrived at the point that we're friends. And it's his 2 children that live, 2 of his children who live here in Logan, who were anxious to have us come here so they could take care of us as we aged.
It's interesting you'd use the term strict. Were your parents strict?
Oh, absolutely.
Your mom more than your dad? Or?
Well, Dad always stood firmly behind Mother, but yeah, when they spoke, you jumped.
What happened if you didn't jump?
I got lots of switchings. I was sent out to get a willow switch quite frequently to...
Is that where that tradition started?
The peach tree tea.
Well, I don't know where the willow...
Go
get a willow so I can whip you.
I don't know if that just happened with me or if it happened with some of my siblings. I don't know. Maybe I was the only naughty one. Because Mother used to say, I hope that you have a daughter just like you so you can understand what I've been through. And I was not, I was kind of difficult because I fought her a lot. I thought I needed to express myself and do things in my way as long as it was acceptable. I didn't want to always be doing it in Mother's way.
Have you got any daughters who blessed you with that same?
No, not my own daughters. No, I never sent anybody out for their own switch. If you're asking for that answer.
You have two brothers who are already gone and a sister. How do you envision when you meet them again?
Well, Morris and I have a different view of the spirit world than lots of people do. Maybe you probably have the same one, because we have a testimony that it's a better place than here, and that the problems, the physical problems and all of those kinds of things will be taken from you, and it will be a place of light and happiness and joy if we've lived up to that. And so,
has growing old been difficult at all for you?
Not in any regard, but moving here and suddenly not being needed anymore, that was hard. Is
that the single biggest challenge with transition?
And then as I get older, I have more and more physical problems. I mean, I'm still healthy as a horse, but I have a hard time moving around. My body is stiffened a lot.
What about singing? Do you sing in public?
No, we can't sing anymore, either one of us.
And at what point did you decide that was?
When we stopped being able to sing, you know.
When your voice won't function.
when you start singing and you stop singing and start coughing, that's when we noticed that there was something wrong. You just dropped something.
Did I drop something? I'm sorry, that's my camera. There are probably different phrases people would use to describe you. Fastidious is one that would come to mind. Is that fair?
Yes, that's fair.
Okay. And when you have idiosyncrasies, how does that affect you socially and how much you intermingle with people?
Tremendously, because I just can't go into social gatherings because I won't eat somebody else's food, and you can't go into somebody's home and say, I'm here, but I'm not going to eat your stuff.
It doesn't come over well, huh?
And Morris seems agreeable to that, so we are just kind of hermits here.
Did you tell him about our first date?
No, I didn't, but it's too painful. I can't tell him about that.
I can tell the story.
What are you laughing about?
I want to tell you, that was
it has to do with my idiocracies, as Morgan would say.
When it became known to us through the bishop and whatever else that we were supposed to get married, as Helen has already told you, we decided that we couldn't let anybody know, you know, this sort of thing. And I did have one date at her insistence with another lady who had divorced her husband. Well, they had mutually divorced, and I went to one function in Sacramento with her. But it was not anything that I did other than just through the obligation that I felt that I needed to maybe lay a foundation of dating, so to speak.
Well, she asked you to go with her.
Yeah, she did. And she'd have had to, because I'd never have asked her. And anyway, we had a high priest social coming up, and it was going to be in the home of our stake high counselor. He wasn't the group leader, but he had a big home and a nice situation, and his wife was the main soprano in the choir, and anyway, we decided that we would go to that together and make some kind of an announcement, I guess.
No, not an, well.
Well, not an announcement, but indicating that we
We're sort of
were
interested in
friends and a dating situation, because by this point we're in the process of a divorce and my wife is gone and all that sort of thing. So we went to this home, and as we walked in, the tables were all set around and they had everybody name in a different place. So she was on one side of the table and I was in another place. All couples were separated, okay? And as the dinner progressed, it was a fine dinner as far as I could tell, and the subject was based on what had happened the night before, which was the canning of apples, her phobia, and the dessert was
Applesauce?
apple pie, and you know, all of this was great in my mind. Everything was fine. And then she was situated between two fellows from the ward, who the one on her right hand was a big, you know, heavy-set fellow, which and kind of repulsive from that standpoint. And on the other hand was her bass singing idol. He loved everything about her, and he was happily married, but she was something special to him. But he had this heavy mustache, and of course the little food particles were flipping in the air off of his mustache. And I didn't realize any of this because I'm on the other side of the table and I'm only looking at her occasionally because we're still just friends. But after the dinner, everybody got in a kind of a semicircle in this big living room, and we were sitting on the sofa together, and she was sitting on my right side, and I would feel this, you know, tense feeling in her body,
Muscles.
flexing, and it happened 2 or 3 times, and I said, "Are you all right?" And she didn't answer verbally, she just nodded her head. And I hated the game they were playing. It's charades.
Oh.
And if there's anything I cannot stand and I can't participate in because I'm too self-conscious, is charades. And I didn't want any part of that stupid game. And she just kept tensing it. And finally I said, are you sure you're all right? And then finally I said, would you like to go? And she nodded her head. And we got up, we excused ourselves and said we had to leave. And, well, I had excuse because I had all those kids at home, and she did too. And so we left. And walking from the door to our car, which was probably the distance from here to the house across the street, she just suddenly started sobbing. And I got to the car and got her in, and she just fell into a heap in the car seat, shaking, just literally shaking, like you were freezing to death, or, you know, just a trauma. And I kept saying, Helen, what is wrong? What is wrong? And she just sobbed and shook and sobbed and shook all the way home. And I got her into the house, and I didn't want to leave her in that situation, and so I kept trying to, and she couldn't talk, she wouldn't talk to me, she couldn't tell me anything, just mumble a few words here and there, and I probably spent 3 or 4 hours in that house with her. Finally, early morning hours, I went home. I had to go home and make sure everything was okay. But it was all because of this phobia situation. And that was our first date.
Great calling card, huh?
And our son, who was our son, when he finally heard this story, he said, why in hell did you ever go back? Family and the strong attributes and characteristics of which they all had, including your parents. And I was a little bit squeamish about meeting the first time. Your mother was, or her mother, your grandmother was dying of cancer. She was in the bed in the living room.
Was she already bedridden by that point?
Yeah, she was in the living room in that bed. That's where she stayed all the time. And anyway, your brothers, her brothers, are all huge.
It goes like this and then up.
And I felt like a little something anemic in relation to them. And not only were they huge in size, they were huge in character and, you know, personality. But Morgan was the one that I became familiar with the most because he would come through California on occasion. And we got pretty well acquainted, and he used to tease me about being pious, you know, above the norm.
Oh, that would be Morgan.
And tell me different stories and different things. And he had a fellow living in his ward that he knew pretty well that I had gone to school with. He had a year behind me in school. And that's how we really became acquainted, because we had a fundraising program in the ward. I was the counselor, first counselor to the bishop, and we were building this chapel, or attempting to raise the money so that we could start it. And that's when that church building program was
Stopped.
started.
Oh, started. Okay.
And when the fellow came down to define the program for us, that's what got the bishop so excited, because he was a carpenter by trade, and he had been a missionary to Argentina, and this fellow had mentioned that they had done this through New Zealand and different areas. In fact, that's where it started. When I was on my mission, this program had its inception in the things that were done in New Zealand. George B. Singer. And but Morgan knew this fellow, and he moved into our ward. And he said, if you want to raise money, I know a man that can come and cook a nice meal for you. And it was Morgan. And Morgan came and put on this big dinner. We had the pit where we roasted the meat, you know, that sort of thing.
Mm.
And he came and spent the whole time there while all this was happening, and was part of the whole thing. And I didn't have any idea who he was, other than he was a friend and a fellow that this guy knew. But that was how I first became acquainted with Morgan, and then from there on, we just, when Helen and I got together, it was, you know.
How long did it take you to learn the family songs?
A long time. I still don't know. But Helen would teach me some of these things, you know, from the hymn book, the family traditionals. But because I could sing, I guess that helped me integrate.
I can't imagine you fitting in as well if you didn't.
Yeah.
Gordon was telling him after Ann's funeral that how much he disliked Morris, because he said he didn't really know why, but he just did, and he was glad to have finally gotten to know him a little bit from this experience, and he's changed his mind.
I'm still, you know, having had very little exposure, stunned at how cunning and funny he is, just with his anecdotal experiences.
You mean Morris?
Yes. And to me, one of the defining things about Ann's funeral is you and Catherine playing, because there's no way in the world that a fastidious woman who's careful about details can easily risk the embarrassment to play in public.
Right.
Because you might hit a wrong note, or she might hit a wrong note, and the timing may not be very good. And you must admit that the practice session didn't give you a lot of hope, did it?
Well, she said, "What are you trying to be, Alexander Schreiner or something?"
Which would be Catherine.
But I'm, you know, I got Richard. I never knew all that well, but he came to Chula Vista once, and then we came to Burley a few times, and I got to know them all. But Richard I knew less. David was longer in getting acquainted, but I think we have a good relationship now.
It was Alma that he got close to.
Yeah,
They kind
it
of speak the
was
same
your
language.
father that took to me right off.
But Morris, quite frankly, he takes to people who are really on the fringe normally. I don't know how to say it any other way.
I mean, somebody he can shape up.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. Morris
He seemed to accept me right off the bat, and he told me one time, he said, I knew in the beginning that Mark was not right for Helen. I knew it all the time. And he also indicated that he felt that I was the opposite. I was right, and it was the right thing. And my brother-in-law, who was married to my older sister, and they're both gone, when he first met Helen, and this was before we were married, he said to me, he said, "You're going to marry that lady, aren't you?" And I said, "Well, I guess so." And I knew we were, but I wasn't about to, you know,
spill the beans.
say everything that I knew. And he said, "Well, if you don't, you're the dumbest person I know."
We got married the day my divorce was final.
Cutting it close, huh? Morris, how would you describe your wife then? If you were to write a paragraph about who she is and what she is, what would you say about her?
About Helen?
Yes.
Oh gosh, I would start out with her strength of character. This is the thing that appealed to me from the very beginning. The fact that she was very strong-minded and strong-willed. And I had a lot of people say, "How in the world would you ever be able to live with her?" People that knew her and knew me. And I had one lady in Mesa, Arizona, that got a copy of her handwriting, and Helen was into handwriting as an analysis of personality. And she fired a letter back to me, and she said, "Morris, don't ever marry that woman. You never can live with her. She's this and that," you know. And that didn't change anything either. No, I would just simply describe her as a very devout Latter-day Saint who has a great knowledge of the gospel, far better than the average LDS lady that I know, and she has all of these traits that just appeal to me, and she's just a great and marvelous lady, and talented beyond excess in terms of what most people have. And she relates with people well, especially after they know her a little bit. Some are intimidated by her in the beginning, but always come to recognize in her the great strength of person and her character and her sense of loyalty to individuals and to causes and to things that are right. She's a marvelous lady.
Thank you.
I'm going to want to ask Helen one final question too. I just want to give you an opportunity to talk about what role faith has played in your experience in 80 years.
Well, my patriarchal blessing told me when I was 16 years old, and Alfred Knight gave me a patriarchal blessing, which I didn't lay much stock in at first, but he told me that I have the gift of faith. And I do have the gift of faith because, and whenever times are bad, I don't feel that I'm being picked on or anything. I just feel like this is another one of those life's experiences, and I just hang in there. And how can you make it from one end of life to the other without faith? And so as soon as I had it proven to me because of paying my tithing that the Lord was there for me, I only had to know that. I only needed to have that kind of experience once, and then having faith from that point on, I knew that when you get to the edge of the cliff and you're about to fall over, if you just that's when the Lord will reach out His hand and pull you back and take care of you. And that's just been my mantra all the time.
Anything else you'd like to say that needs to be recorded?
Not that I can think of right now.
You'll think of something 5 minutes after I leave.
Perhaps.
Any thoughts on the music that would define your celebration before? Since I didn't give you advance warning, you've had almost an hour to have it in the back of your mind.
Music is just the defining thing in my life. That's the way I gained my testimony, was through music. It's the way the Lord answers my prayers. It's part of my thought processes. That's the way I learned the scriptures, is by singing them. And almost anything that I know that I've memorized has been through music. And it's just a rock I stand on. And I'm convinced that I had those kinds of feelings in the pre-existence, and that's why they came with me. And my earliest memories are of loving music. One of the very earliest things I remember is when I was just really tiny. I begged for a harmonica for Christmas, and I got a toy one. And I was so angry when I blew into it once and I knew it was a toy. I threw it as hard as I could send it. And that was one time Mother didn't spank me because she was proud that I knew the difference.
What's it like to sing with the angels?
Well, it's a very exhilarating feeling to feel that you're being supported, and that a power beyond yourself is shaping what you're doing into something really magnificent.
I appreciate that. Thank you.